When was the last time an animated movie hit theaters that was rated PG-13 or higher? You can't think of one off the top of your head, can you? I couldn't either, at least in terms of American-made productions. The vast majority of all animated media released in the US is targeted toward children. And though the recent release of superhero projects like the Spiderverse movies and Invincible are a step in the right direction, there's a great lack of mature animated media for people to consume. One might argue that there are plenty of adult-oriented shows to watch, and there are, but almost all of them are episodic dark comedies. And don't get me wrong, I think these animated sitcoms can be hilarious. My nightly routine for about a year was to put on an episode of Family Guy before I went to bed. But we have an abundance of these episodic series and a major lack of story-driven ones. All of that being said, the medium has come a long way since it first came to fruition. The United Productions of America, or UPA, which was founded by ex-Disney employees, started a major push for cinematic modernism within animated projects. Because before this push, animation was only a fun escape from the harsh realities of live-action film, where the majority of works produced were meant to be comedic and lighthearted. The UPA helped animated projects win the Oscars and other major awards soon after its startup, which in turn helped popularize Saturday morning cartoons. They also started the idea of having modern themes within their narratives, often leftist political commentary or propaganda, but nonetheless. We do this today within animation, but the themes or messages are often very subtle. A given story isn't typically driven by a political or human rights issue. Animation isn't allowed to be that explicit in its meaning, because it's for children, of course, and these kids don't have to face the reality of racism, classism, or depression head on. They can view some of these issues with cute and funny characters in movies like The Lion King, Zootopia, Soul, you name it. My point is that live action movies, while they can be subtle as well, tend to throw some of these important issues in your face a bit more. Whereas the goal of these animated films is ultimately to sprinkle a bit of insight on these topics over top of whatever the main goal of the story really is. This is not to say that Disney movies, for example, are less valuable than any given live-action film. Like any good narrative piece, the ideas and themes often have to be dissected and studied a bit in order to get meaning from them. The Lion King is said to be directly inspired by the Shakespeare play Hamlet, and if you know the story of Hamlet, you would know that it's not necessarily suitable for children, but the narrative is portrayed in such a way that is soothing and entertaining for them. You have these funny little animals singing and dancing throughout the movie, so it feels appropriate for kids to watch. But some of the topics and lessons discussed could be directed toward all ages. There are glimpses of racism, revenge, self-reflection, and self-acceptance, all themes that anybody could relate to. I appreciate these children's films for this very reason. Powerful topics can be shared to young brains in their early developmental years, which can be very important. I just believe we need a larger variety, meant for some of the more mature audiences out there. Don't get me wrong, animation studios hopped on to helping out adults very early on into the era of Saturday morning cartoons. Very adult references were, and honestly still are, thrown into what are seemingly the most lighthearted shows you could watch. Then you age a bit and rewatch that cartoon and realize how many dirty jokes were in that SpongeBob episode you used to watch as a kid. This was all for the parents that were stuck watching cartoons with their little ones, but they were rewarded for it. And after some time, the adults finally won, and were able to have their own adult cartoons with only adult jokes. The most famous ones being The Simpsons, Family Guy, South Park, etc. And they all have a few things in common. They're all episodic, meaning that whatever happens in one episode doesn't transfer over into the next. They all also use slapstick as one of the main sources of comedic entertainment, just as many children's cartoons do as well. And they all have dark humor, some much darker than others. These are the two most popular forms of animated media in America, the kids' comedies and the adult comedies. There is very little in between, but of course there are outliers, many of which were some of my favorite shows to watch growing up, like the original Teen Titans, or Batman Beyond, and even Avatar: The Last Airbender. These shows were targeted toward younger and older teens alike, most of which were also episodic series though, and not narrative ones. However, in the past decade, one show has made a daring and grand breakthrough when it comes to mature and gritty narrative animation, and that is Bojack Horseman. Which is first posed as your typical animated sitcom with some crazy shenanigans and witty humor, but whenever something bad happens to any given character, that action or event carries over into the next episode. If Bojack crashes his car in one episode, he has to buy a new car in the next one. Of course, there are themes and running gags that will carry over from episode to episode, but outside of some wild, humorous coincidences, the show mimics reality, sometimes a bit too well. I'm not going to say that Bojack is the first to hop on this idea, because MTV's Downtown does something very similar, but with no animals and less drug use. Many have tried to push the animated envelope, but I feel that Bojack Horseman was the most popular of the very few breakthroughs. There are some things that live action just can't do, or at least can't do as well as animation. An example from Bojack is how the majority of flashbacks were stylized in a way to help elevate the levels of isolation and hatred that come from Bojack's childhood. Moods and emotions can be enhanced with this visual flair, where it could potentially be mimicked in the live action version of the show, but it likely wouldn't have the same effect, nor would it be as popular. If Bojack Horseman specifically was a live action series instead of an animated one, the incredibly dark realities of life that are portrayed in this somewhat pastel manner would feel much too harsh and may turn viewers away. Animating these real-life issues helps soften the impact and allows people to receive these messages with much less fear due to the belief that what they're seeing technically could never happen. Now, we recognize that animation is not a genre but a storytelling medium. So how do we fix this crappy American system that, for the most part, polarizes various versions of comedic television between children and adults? How do we get that happy medium? How do we get that variety? The answer, of course, is anime. Duh. Japanese animation studios have been putting out content for every possible demographic for about half a century now. There are shows for children, young boys, older boys to adult men, young girls, and older girls to adult women. Of course, this also means that every genre is utilized, and they've also created some interesting new subgenres as well. Each of these demographics has specific names, and almost all of these works are first produced as a comic or manga. If a manga reaches a certain level of popularity, one of the dozens of animation studios in Japan picks up said manga and animates it. Because it's a proven story with various audiences, there is no gamble in putting money into it. Typically. At least 100 new seasons of these anime come out every year. Granted, they're not all new series, some are continuations of previously aired shows, but the majority of these manga artists who create these stories don't do it for the money either. Animation studios do, but these artists all have passion for drawing and creating meaningful pieces of art, and those greedy studios are able to recognize that, so a lot of the time it ends in a win-win situation for the artists and the businessmen. There are probably more anime airing in Japan than live action, but there are still an abundance of your typical dramas, crime shows, and comedies floating around outside the animation network. They have such a great balance, which is why such a large portion of younger Americans shifted toward watching anime during the pandemic, because it felt fresh, and after exhausting your Netflix queue, anything seems to be worth a shot. And it struck a chord with a lot of people because consuming an entirely different style of media consistently can be really eye-opening, and it would be monumental if Americans were able to experience such wild and imaginative pieces of art outside of the occasional DreamWorks or Disney feature targeted toward 10-year-olds every year. I know it's not an easy task, and there are a lot more people that have tried to break through the system that I've given credit for, but the real enemy here is the fear of change. It's easy to get complacent and stay on the same path forever, but new doors are constantly opening, and I think all it will take is a few more of these money-hungry company heads to walk through some of those doors. And when that time comes, what's to follow? World peace? Yeah, probably.